I'd like to see Mrs. Stoddard, if you'd be so kind.
Mrs. Stoddard?
This is Collinwood, isn't it?
Yes.
And the mistress here is Mrs. Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, is she not?
Yes.
Then perhaps you'd do me the courtesy to inform Mrs. Stoddard that her cousin is calling and wishes to pay his respects.
Her cousin?
Yes, her cousin from England.
From England? Oh, please, come in.
I'd be delighted, thank you.
Oh, would you like to wait in the drawing room?
Here would be fine, thank you. Oh, madam, if you would, you may tell her that it's Barnabas Collins. You also allowed your friend Jason to follow you to the cemetery.
Actors never know what role might make them famous. One of the great ironies of 20th century pop culture was that a classically trained Canadian actor took America by storm with his portrayal of a 175-year-old vampire. The show was Dark Shadows, saved from cancellation in 1967 when it introduced Shakespearean actor Jonathan Frid into the storyline as Barnabas Collins, multimedia's first sympathetic vampire. The iconic image of Frid as Barnabas Collins adorned comic books and paperback Gothic novels, bubblegum cards, and even a board game, complete with coffin.
He plays Barnabas Collins. Here's Jonathan Frid.
Frid appeared on Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas, Dick Cavett, and The Tonight Show. No television show seemed safe from the vampire's shadow.
Panel, may I remind you, it is one question at a time. I'll give you 2 minutes to try and establish the identity of our mystery guest. And we'll begin the questioning with Arlene Francis.
I never heard such a happy audience. And it sounded like a lot of young voices. Are you particularly appealing to the young?
Yes.
Overnight, Frid became rock star famous, with screaming teenagers thronging to his personal appearances like he was one of the Beatles. Today, 5 decades after Dark Shadows went off the air in April 1971, the show is still a pop culture touchstone. But what was the appeal of Barnabas Collins? And who was the man beneath the vampire's cloak?
Night is drawing nearer and nearer to Collinwood. And the man who disappeared into another night has not been found. But out of the falling dusk, another man has come. A stranger who is not a stranger. A man with a face long familiar to those who live at Collinwood. A man who has come a great distance, but who still bears deep within him a soul shaped by the far country from which he came.
Where's your home, Jonathan, originally?
I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada.
I didn't know you had somebody Canadian.
John Herbert Frid was born on December 2nd, 1924, the third and youngest son of Flora McGregor and Herbert Percival Frid. The family owned and operated Frid Construction, one of the leading construction firms in Hamilton. The Frid family also supported the development of parks and green spaces throughout the city and neighboring communities.
I knew HP a little bit as he passed away when I was about 7 years old, but I do remember him very quiet, laid back, very gentle man.
My grandfather and then my father, who took over the construction company, were the businessmen, and my grandmother was the PR person. She would entertain all the clients. She was the life of the party, the belle of the ball.
Jonathan and his brothers spent summers at his maternal grandparents' sprawling estate in Waterdown. It was called the Clunes, named after his grandmother's childhood home in Scotland. The property included a pond and 7 cottages. While his mother, Flora, hosted garden parties, Jonathan enjoyed recreational time with his cousins, away from his rigorous studies at school.
The first time I was ever nervous at acting was simply getting up on the aisle in school and having to recite a poem in class. And I would shiver with fear.
Jonathan's early education took place at Hillfield School, an all-boys preparatory school. Jonathan struggled academically at Hillfield, which caused lingering feelings of low self-esteem. Both Jonathan and his brother Ken suffered from dyslexia, which was not properly understood at the time.
When I was 16, I begged to be in the senior play because usually the only people that were in it were drafted into it because they were the top 6 smart students in the class, of the top 2 classes. And of course I was never in the top 6. However, they tested me and he gave me the role of Sir Anthony Absolute in Sheridan's The Rivals. We used to rehearse those things for 6 to 8 weeks, and I don't think I did any studying at all for those weeks. All I did was to get that role down to such perfection.
Jonathan spent so much time working on The Rivals, he failed 2 subjects, which meant he would have to repeat his junior year at Hillfield. Instead, he moved to Westdale Collegiate for his senior year of high school. There, he was cast as King Charles II in a comedy entitled So to Bed, but he also began to look for other opportunities to be on stage.
We're at the Players Guild of Hamilton, and I, at this point in time, run the costume department in this theater. Jonathan enjoyed a wonderful few years here. He was 17 years old when he first came to the Guild. Gladys Gillen was the director that really caught Jonathan Frid's imagination and helped him to further hone his abilities on the stage. She was an American. Her stories about New York probably planted the seeds for Jonathan's decision a little later in life to go to the States. Jonathan went to McMaster University and he belonged to the drama club, of course. He decided to call Gladys because he'd had such a good experience with her at the Players Guild, and he invited her to direct a couple of plays at McMaster, The Royal Family and The Barretts of Wimpole Street.
Jonathan's years at McMaster were interrupted by World War II. All 3 Frid brothers entered the armed forces. Jonathan enlisted in the Royal Canadian Navy in 1944, where he was assigned to the HMCS Algonquin. Fortunately, the Japanese surrendered before Jonathan would see combat. Jonathan returned to McMaster, where he would become drama club president and graduated with the university's Honor Society Award for Drama.
Then I went to England and I studied at the Royal Academy. I didn't complete my course there. You know how people, when they're young, they can't wait to start working. And I went into repertory down in Kent and another repertory company in Cornwall. And I finally did a national tour of a West End success called The Third Visitor, in which I played an American gangster.
While in England following a performance of Venus Observed in the West End, Jonathan met the actor he admired most, Laurence Olivier. Olivier counseled the young actor to correct any technical flaws in his diction, an essential accomplishment for an actor serious about the classics. Jonathan took Olivier's advice to heart. Jonathan returned to Canada and ventured to Toronto, looking to start his theatrical career in earnest. He made his Shakespearean debut during the summer of 1951 at the Toronto Shakespeare Festival, directed and produced by Earl Grey. Eager to enhance his vocal strength for the great Shakespearean roles, he attended voice classes at Lorne Greene's Academy of Radio Arts. Practice sessions included tongue twister poetry.
The teeny tiny woman opened the teeny tiny gate and went into a teeny tiny churchyard. And when this teeny tiny woman had got into the teeny tiny churchyard, she saw a teeny tiny bone on a teeny tiny grave. There once were 2 cats of Kilkenny. Each thought there was 1 cat too many. So they fought and they fit, and they scratched and they bit, till, excepting their nails and the tips of their tails, instead of 2 cats, there weren't any.
Jonathan came back to the area. He was part of a production called A Sleep of Prisoners. The production fascinated him because it was held in a church, Centenary United Church, right downtown in the middle of all the hustle and bustle of Hamilton. 1954 saw Jonathan involved in the Dominion Drama Festival. The Dominion Drama Festival was actually an organization made up of a number of other smaller festivals. The one that Hamilton belonged in was the Western Ontario Drama League, WODL, and he was in Rebecca, and they went to the WODL level and performed very well, were called Best Play, and Jonathan Frid got a mention for his portrayal. And they went from there as the best of that festival to the Dominion Drama Festival. They found themselves in a 2,000-seat theater, the Palace Theater here in downtown Hamilton. It was unfortunate in many respects because a number of actors finding themselves in this huge house with this a great expanse of stage started shouting their lines. The critics were not amused. Jonathan was mortified that Rebecca was not received better after its performance at the Palace Theater. And it's a shame because it's probably one of the last times that he actually performed up here before he made the decision to go to the States.
I wanted to be a director at one point in my life, so I went down to the Yale Drama School and took directing there. But I've never directed yet, and professionally, but I want to do it someday.
I met Jonathan Frid at the Yale School of Drama, where we all were students together, and he was kind of awesome in the sense of a presence that he had. It was like meeting an actor from the Royal Shakespeare Company in terms of the kind of quality that he had of dignity and class, basically.
When I was at Yale, there was a guy whose name I heard before I ever met him, John Frid. And actors, some of them had funny stories about him, and I think almost everybody liked John Frid. And Jonathan was a kind of a classical actor, really, when I first knew him. And he would be in Shakespeare and so on. Excellent, versatile actor.
You had to act. If you're going to be a director, you have to know what the emotional and psychological process of an actor is to be able to communicate with them and help them.
After completing the first year of his master's program, Jonathan was chosen to be a leading actor for the inaugural season of the Williamstown Theater Festival in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Jonathan would appear in 8 of the 10 plays presented in just 10 weeks. It was a grueling schedule, but he nevertheless found it exhilarating. When the summer season ended, he headed back to New Haven for his second year at Yale.
Directors, of course, have to cover all fields, from acting to knowing the physics of lighting, and we had to do ground plans, elevations for stage design. We had to do all these things. And so it was really kind of a marvelous 3 years for me, and I'll always be grateful for Yale.
After receiving high praise for his portrayal of Tullus Ophidius in Shakespeare's Coriolanus at Yale, Jonathan was invited to join the acting company of the American Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Connecticut. For 2 consecutive summer seasons, Jonathan was thrilled to have the opportunity to work with a number of distinguished actors, such as Alfred Drake and Katharine Hepburn.
I was in a production of Othello with him at the Stratford, Connecticut Shakespeare Festival. And Jonathan came on as a vigorous soldier, sword at his side, got to the center of the stage, and delivered the first 3 lines from The Merchant of Venice. He realized he was in the wrong play, made a sharp right, stumbled a little, went to the edge of the stage to leave, and the set in those days, if you can picture this, was called the Venetian blinds that went all the way up to the ceiling. Jonathan, in his turn to exit, crashed into the nearest Venetian blind, tried to get away from it, but his sword had gone into between the two close together lats thing, and he couldn't jerk it loose. So I think he finally let it just pull out and hang there and went off stage. Somehow it got on with the rest of the play. He said, I don't know what happens with me.
Jonathan joined Hepburn and other members of the American Shakespeare Festival following his graduation from Yale on a national tour of Much Ado About Nothing. When the tour concluded, Jonathan settled into an apartment near Washington Square Park in New York City. Despite his interest in directing and teaching, Jonathan's passion was to act.
George Morfogen and I co-produced The Golem, which Jonathan Frid was in. It was our first show off-Broadway. Jonathan played the antagonist, so he had that aesthetic weight. He had the gravitas, which was electrifying on stage, which he drew him.
Dear Mother and Dad, while the press has been most favorable for Moon and the Yellow River, the public response has not. In fact, it has gone from bad to worse. Last week, our closing notice went up. And so the unemployment situation throughout the nation will be worsened come next Sunday. Dear Mother and Dad, last week I was called to read for the role of Ronnie in the Broadway production of A Passage to India. While the audition went brilliantly, I think I gave the most flawless reading of my career. The producers showed great interest in me after it was over. I answered their questions precisely, and for once in my life, I didn't talk too much. Today the readings were transferred to the Winter Garden Theatre. What a difference this always makes from the comfortable circumstances of a private room. Each of us read very briefly. One is cut off all too soon, no chance to get going, only some quality they want to see. And so you walk off stage, the half smile to the stage manager, and a feeble thank you, and then a stupid, insincere good luck to the others you would rather see dead as you grab your coat and lose yourself in the crowded street. Well, the role in Passage to India finally went to a well-known actor about town called Louis Edmonds. It was a sad miss. I think the biggest disappointment to date.
Why do you become an actor? Why do you become a director? It's obviously something that you dare possess to share with the world. Why would you put up with all the stuff that you have to put up with unless there's something that obsesses you that you want to say and share or that you have to do? And, being an actor, you have to share your soul.
I took my first Broadway bow last Thursday night after going on for an actor I was covering. After 4 performances, I feel like a veteran. By then, I was getting solid laughs precisely timed. As I came off the stage Saturday night, Betsy Palmer said, "You were just plain brilliant tonight." Well, naturally, I felt glorious, a moment in which a lifelong dream was achieved. Dear Mother and Dad, after a month or two of which seemed to presage hard times, I'm back in business with contracts signed for what could be a comfortably long stay at the Phoenix Theatre in Henry IV Part 2, which I'm now rehearsing. I've only 2 scenes, but they are good ones. I'm playing Scroop, Archbishop of York. Also in May, I will be taking over the role of the Earl of Worcester in Henry IV Part 1. A somewhat larger part, Worcester is the leader of the opposing forces to the king.
Oh, no. My nephew must not know, Sir Richard, the liberal and kind offer of the king.
'Twere best he did.
Then are we all undone. It is not possible, it cannot be, the king should keep his word in loving us. He will suspect us still, and find the time to punish this offense in other faults. Therefore, good cousin, let not Harry know in any case the offer of the king.
Deliver what you will, I'll say to
My uncle has returned. Uncle, what news? The king will bid you battle presently.
Defy him!
There's no seeming mercy in the king.
Did you beg any? God forbid.
The Prince of Wales stepped forth before the king, and nephew challenged you to single fight.
Oh, would the quarrel lay upon our heads, and that no man might draw a short breath today but I and Harry Monmouth.
Following the broadcast of Henry IV Part 1, Jonathan took his agent's advice and changed his stage name from simple John Frid to the more imposing Jonathan Frid.
Dear Mother and Dad, Good news this morning. I was called to appear in a couple of installments of As the World Turns, a soap opera. I'm to play a psychiatrist. The heroine is apparently in a bad way. Not unusual, I guess. I hope she gets worse and needs me often.
Now, I was sitting at home, by the way, watching this. I'd never been on a soap before at this point. The wife had been very ill, and the husband said to her, "Look, I'm called this doctor to come and see you. He's a psychiatrist." "I don't want to see any psychiatrists." So he said, "Oh, but he's on his way over here right now." And I went, "Good God, I'm supposed to be down at the studio. He's coming right now." That's how naive I was. And so finally, when I got that settled, I think I called them, and they said, "You're not on for a while yet. You relax."
We were on the verge of this period going into the Kennedy administration, where culture was like the hula hoop for a moment of the times. And the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts and eventually state governments started funding nonprofit theaters throughout the country so that cities would have their own theater companies doing the great works instead of just getting Broadway shows that were touring on the way in or out of New York. That changed things in the American theater.
It gave audiences around the country a chance to come and see professional actors doing these plays, and that helped spread theater around the country.
The regional theaters began to pick me up and asked me to come out and offer me nice parts. And out there in the field, I had a wonderful time playing things out there.
I met Jonathan in the 60s, and he was an actor that had been brought in to play the role of Oberon Tiresias, and I played Philostrate Puck. So my major scenes were with Jonathan. The production was at Front Street Theater, which was a regional theater of the day, and it was in Memphis.
So I'm a young actor. I was about 28, I think, in Philadelphia. I'd done 2 years at Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. Anyway, the company there, we assemble, and there's this guy with a great voice, and he could handle classical material. He could handle words. So we did a play by Henri called Pour Bitos, and he was also in the Sheridan that we did. Critic.
March 1965. Dear Mother and Dad, I'm getting more convinced than ever that I'll probably make my mark in this kind of theater. Regional theaters, universities, rather than in commercial television. I feel I have a flair for one and not the other. The encouraging thing is that there is so very much work around the country these days.
Summer before that, I had played Coriolanus in San Diego, so they wanted me to come back, and I thought that was great. And I just said to Jonathan, I said, "You want to go to San Diego?" "Why not? Who wouldn't want to?" So I called him. I said, "There's a guy here you got to see. You got to get him. He's good. Get him before somebody else gets him." Jonathan Frid. So we did Romeo and Juliet. And then we went into rehearsal for The Tempest. They had offered me Caliban. We had a read-through, and I pulled Jonathan. I said, "Jonathan, you want to play Caliban?" He just lit up. He said, "Yeah." And so I told the head of the theater, Craig Knoll at the time, I said, "I don't want to do Caliban, but I'll do Jonathan's part and let Jonathan do Caliban." And so everybody was okay with that.
I was a young actor, or wannabe actor, in San Diego, and I went to see a production of The Tempest. And I was taken by this character, by the Caliban. This guy was passionate and just very theatrical, and you could understand him. And I still, to this day, remember the performance.
He had a wonderful season because he played Caliban, and he played the hell out of it. So then they asked me to come back and do Iago, which I definitely wanted to do. And I thought I'd see Jonathan there, and then I said, "What happened? Where's Jonathan?" I said, "Oh, he's doing this TV thing." He says, "Jonathan gave up Shakespeare to do some piece of TV? You gotta be kidding." And it was something called Dark Shadows. And then the rest is history.
The plan was to cast a guy that we were going to kill off in a very short period of time. but just to try and make it as scary as possible.
I had just arrived home from a national tour of Hostile Witness with Ray Milland. I hadn't even dropped my bags when the phone rang, and my agent said, they're looking for a vampire for a soap opera called Dark Shadows. And I thought, well, that's one for the books. We'll go and read for it and see what happens.
I was going to London, and I left it up to my people to send me pictures of actors that had come in to read for the character of Barnabas. And there was one photograph. It was a guy on a stage. He was wearing a cape. So even though I could barely see what he looked like, I called my casting guy, a guy named Alan Shane, and I said, who is this guy? And he said, well, his name is Jonathan Frid. He's a very fine Shakespearean actor. He's a Canadian. And I said, he can really act, right? And he said, oh, yes, he's wonderful, he's wonderful. I said, all right, cast him.
And one day, this coffin was opened by Willie Loomis, who was had turned into a grave robber, and he found the secret tomb quite by accident. Was fascinated by the fact that he saw this coffin with chains around it. When he opened the coffin, a hand lunged out and got him by the throat. A day or two later, I made my first real appearance.
This is no way to greet a relative. Welcome to Collinsville.
Thank you, cousin.
And when we put the vampire on, forget it. I mean, the ratings went through the roof. I have never seen anything like this in my life.
What brought the audience was Jonathan Frid, who played the vampire Barnabas, and he chose to play him not like a monster, but like a romantic hero who has been cursed to have to be someone who drinks blood to stay alive. He was always tortured when he had to look for a victim. You go through the throes of just heart-wrenching desolation.
Well, and then he became a tragic figure. And women, it just got crazier and crazier. I mean, we had to put on special people to process the mail that used to come in gigantic truckloads.
Meanwhile, I wasn't at all satisfied with what I was doing on the show. I was very nervous at first, but somehow that played into the role.
I was a Collins. Why didn't you protect me? Where were you when I was turned into something that even my own father loathed? If his ghost is here with yours, tell him I've come home. I claim this house as mine, and whatever power you or he may have is ended. I am free now and alive. Chains with which he bound me are broken, and I've returned to live the life I never had. Whatever that may turn out to be.
Then when we went back into the past, I played my pre-vampire days when I was a hero, I mean, a good guy.
Is the price too high?
No price is too high for Sarah's life.
Then, if she lives, you will marry me. You will make me your wife.
I told you I'd do anything for you as long as you cure Sarah.
I've had many situations and many emotions and many moods and many compulsions to play.
I am where I want very much to be. In your arms.
I love you, Josette.
And I love you very much.
What we felt for each other, we could not fight. Then you will fight me. No.
No!
You have your choice of weapon.
You will not fight. The curse has made you one of the living dead.
Then, according to the curse, you must die.
No, Barnabas, please!
Yes, my dear.
No!
All your powers of witchcraft will not save you now!
Sarah, no. No.
I mean, I played everything. In this one role, I played a dozen roles. I mean, it's been a marvelous thing because he has so many facets to it.
Jonathan Frid had the kind of personality that you don't find in actors, and that is he was concerned with the other person. Actors of necessity are concerned about themselves. You know, they have to be. But when you meet someone like Jonathan, who's just good, which is a terrible thing to say about a vampire, but he was, it's a pleasure.
You are under my influence. You cannot resist me. Do you understand?
I understand.
And you will never tell anyone about me.
I will tell no one. I will never fail you. Never.
I think a decade went by and I suddenly realized John Frid, Dark Shadows, he's the king vampire of the show. Somebody said, why don't you have John on your show? And it was my morning show, and I was fairly new to it all. He came on the show, and I was looking forward to seeing him again, but I was out there in front of the audience, and he came on with a surprise. He was fully dressed as Barnabas Collins, the vampire, and his fans went crazy.
Jonathan, I think you've created a monster. This is Jonathan Frid. I know you don't want to believe that because you want to think it's Barnabas. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, Dick.
What's the latest development now in Barnabas' life? I know you can speak for him.
Well, all I know at this point really is that I'm not a vampire.
So it could be temporary, though, couldn't it? I mean, the spell is not necessarily totally...
Well, you see, it all depends on the monster Adam. As long as he lives, I will be all right. Somehow or other, don't ask me why or how it happens, but some of my life force is in him, and I think this show has more medical quackery than any other soap opera.
The first role I played on Dark Shadows, I played 3 different characters. I played Eve, the most evil lady who ever lived. And I was created on the operating table by Barnabas and Dr. Hoffman. And the first thing I realized when I worked with them, and I was silent because I was not yet alive, but I could see them, was that I was with really talented people. These were really great actors. And the second thing was I noticed Jonathan's cheekbones. I loved them. They were so high. I've never seen cheekbones so high. And then the third thing, which was the best part of Jonathan Frid, the voice. He had a marvelous voice, and it was fitting. He was a Shakespearean actor.
I used my background in Shakespeare. You know, I played Macbeth, played Richard III, who indeed has a conscience himself at the end. And all these things fed into Barnabas, and Barnabas turned out to be really a very rich and satisfying experience. The only thing I felt frustrated about doing it was the format of soap opera in those days when you did a show every day without stopping. There were no retakes.
You need ice water in your veins to do a soap opera because you have so little rehearsal.
I mean, I could learn a script, but just by reading through it, and I go, and I knew it. Some of the veteran actors had more difficulty.
It was a tough going for me for a long while because anything I'd been done before, it was on the stage, and you have lots of time to learn plays. And that beginning was way back when I was a kid in school. But some of those kids at school were very smart. They'd know their lines in a week or 2 weeks before I knew mine. I had a very definite problem with it. I remember Joan Bennett, that she had trouble with lines too, because she was used to having 6 months instead of a week to learn that amount of dialogue. I was always looking for someone to help me with my lines, and she was just doing the same thing.
When we got into the supernatural and went back into the various periods, the technical people had a field day. It was like making an MGM movie every day, and the only drawback about that was that very often we actors felt that we were being slighted with rehearsal time. The technical aspect got first priority.
Oh, we had a camera blocking around 10 o'clock, and that was after doing the blocking up in the rehearsal room. And then we had what we called a stumble through. And then we had a dress rehearsal.
Jonathan would finish a long, endless speech, dress rehearsal, and then he would say, or words to that effect. And we knew exactly what he meant.
So I started off, I was just a nervous wreck. But I finally got into the rhythm of doing this. And I was looking at scenes, and it's amazing how cool I was later on. I was able to manage those scenes.
There was never a time. Never. He never made light of what he was going to do.
Played it completely for real and invested in every single moment a complete sense of believability. And we did not camp it up at all.
You must leave Collinwood tonight. Please. You've got to leave Collinwood before it's too late, before you get caught, before something happens to you.
No, Quentin. Nothing will make me leave Collinwood now. Nothing. You're very kind to worry about me, Quentin. But don't. I'll take care of myself.
He approached that as if he was doing King Lear. And that set the tone, I think, for the company as a whole.
While some viewers cried and others rushed to call ABC TV, Jonathan was spending his 4-week hiatus playing the role of Tony Wendis in the crime mystery play Dial M for Murder. The production ran for 2 weeks to sold-out crowds at the Little Theater on the Square in Sullivan, Illinois.
He came back and he did say to me, well, thank you for carrying the load here while I was gone. But of course, I was delighted, to be able to do that.
It's him. Oh, God, what's going on here? What's going on?
We welcome to our microphones Jonathan Frid, ladies and gentlemen. Have you worked with Olivier?
No, I wish I had, but no, I haven't. I mean, he's been my idol all my life.
What was it like to work with Kate Hepburn?
I've worked with many stars, but Hepburn stands out, of course. She's fabulous offstage and onstage. I was like any other fan of anybody else. I mean, I know what a fan feels like because I have been a fan myself.
One day, I remember going out the front door of the studio, and there were some school kids there. A week later, it was double the size and then quadruple the size. And suddenly we had a whole street full of kids who had come to the studio after school to see us.
So I got to go to the studio. And on April 17th, 1969, I got to meet him. And my little red scrapbook was the catalyst because he was fascinated that I had all these magazine articles and he wanted to see it.
I like to say I'm a first-generation Dark Shadows fan, having discovered it in its initial run and becoming completely obsessed with the show as a fourth grader.
it was biggest with kids. I remember that at one point we moved the show from 4 o'clock to 3:30. We got reams of mail saying, no, my kid can't get home from school to watch it. And we went back to 4 o'clock.
My fan loyalty was definitely divided between Jonathan Frid as Barnabas. He carried so much tragedy with that character and history, and there were so many layers. And even as a kid, I was just riveted by that. My other favorite character is the inimitable Grayson Hall as Dr. Julia Hoffman, and the two of them together as the kind of paranormal Ghostbusters that they were, working together and time traveling and all the adventures that they had with the unrequited love angle. I was just completely hooked.
She won't always be angry, Barnabas, if you listen to her. If you don't want what you shouldn't.
And what is that?
You think I'm jealous of Vicky, don't you? Well, I'm not. Not at all.
Jonathan would ask Valerie and I to do a variety of different things. We'd go to Grand Central and we would pick out all the magazines that came out that week so that he could look at them and see what they wrote about him.
Is your fan mail still unusual? Yes, some of it. As a matter of fact, I've been very bad about answering it lately, so I got a little club together about 2 weekends ago in the studio, and we took over the rehearsal hall during the weekend, and it was like the post office at Christmas time.
And when we walked into that rehearsal hall, you couldn't even believe what you saw. There were boxes A to Z, and then mail bags that were piled high about 5 feet in the air. We never thought that we would ever get through this mail, ever.
Jonathan, someone handed me the Grand Rapids Times. The headline is TV Vampire Causes Grand Rapids Airport Riot. What have you done? I took a 10-city tour in 5 days, which was kind of rough going. But the thing about it was that no one really expected a turnout that we would get in all these airports and shopping centers and things like that, so that there was no kind of organized control of crowds. We were late getting into Grand Rapids, and they had a crowd where our plane landed, and the thing got so out of hand that we all got kind of nervous. There was so much uncontrolled chaos, and so we got this hearse. While I was getting on top of this hearse, I was rather, if you'll pardon the expression, mortified. And so anyway, we were sort of circling around in front of these thousands of teenagers and so forth, and a regular commercial airliner was unloading at that point, and suddenly I was trying to think of their point of view. Here they were with these thousands of kids and this idiot on top of this hearse with fangs and fangs. And what was it going on? What's happened to America?
And they asked us to come into the studio and record our album. It was Bob Cobert's music.
We went over to the studio. There was never more than 2 takes. Most of them were done on 1 take. Midnight. A hush falls through the melancholy halls of Collinwood. The solemn moon casts dark shadows over the placid stillness of the old mansion.
And the album went on to be a big seller. It was a hit.
Jonathan was invited by Tricia Nixon to be the special guest at the White House Halloween party for local underprivileged children on Halloween in 1969. Jonathan always made himself available to support charities, including the United Cerebral Palsy Telethon in Oklahoma City, Birmingham, Alabama, and Monroe, Louisiana. He also appeared on the Jerry Lewis Labor Day Muscular Dystrophy Telethon. For Jonathan, it was always about helping the children and making them smile.
When he went to the West Coast, he was at Marineland and appeared with all these different animals. I don't know why a vampire would be appearing with animals, but they did that. And then the piece de resistance was his crowning Miss American Vampire at Palisades Amusement Park. That was the most hilarious thing you ever saw. He was there, it must have been 100 degrees out, and he's wearing a suit. and he has to crown this girl that's dressed like Elvira. That's what she looked like.
I decided I would try and make a Dark Shadows movie. I mean, no one's ever done that before. Let's see if that's going to work. Sam Hall and Gordon Russell and myself sat down and worked out an outline where we could do whatever we wanted to do. We didn't have to worry about perpetuating him. We could make him a real marauder because we could kill him.
The movie I thought was too violent. It didn't have the charm or the Never Never world of the television show.
Julia, do you believe in the existence of vampires?
You're not really serious.
But he is, Julia.
I command you to come to me!
Barnabas Collins, vampire.
MGM offered Dan Curtis the opportunity to do a second Dark Shadows film following the success of House of Dark Shadows. However, Jonathan was not happy with the depiction of the character in the first film and feared being typecast. An insistent Curtis informed his star that if he had no interest in portraying Barnabas in the film, he no longer had to play Barnabas on television. In December 1970, Jonathan was notified his contract would be canceled at the end of the next production cycle. Ironically, a few weeks later, ABC canceled the series.
There was an ABC executive, very well known, Brandon Stoddard, and I remember he told me years later that when the show was canceled, he asked the guard at ABC to find him an alternate route out of the building because Dark Shadows fans came and beseeched him to put it back on the air.
It's hard to describe the success of that show, isn't it, John?
I've really never been able to figure it out, but I'm enjoying it immensely, but I've never been able to figure it out.
I find it a little irritating sometimes when people talk about Anne Rice creating the vampire with a conscience. That is not true. It was definitely the combination of the writing of the character of Barnabas Collins and Jonathan Frid's absolutely inimitable performance of that character. That I think when we think of monsters, we think of them as monsters. That's what we're trained to think of them as. But Dark Shadows had a human side to the monster. You got to see what made the monster tick. And it had been explored in movies before, like Frankenstein and so forth, but you never really got to indulge the storytelling the way you do in the format of an ongoing daytime serial where they're telling 5 half-hour plays a week for 5 years. Just the way that the show blended all of those elements, bringing in the turn of the screw and Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, the Gothic romance and the Gothic horror, it was an incredible alchemy that has not been duplicated since, as far as I'm concerned.
He brought a very Gothic, romantic quality to this role that I guess will live forever.
How can I destroy you?
I am destroyed already. What you will do is save me. Free me from this endless torment.
I can't do it.
If you are my friend,
I am.
Then do it.
No.
Free me. Give me peace at last. Let me return to those who are at rest. Do not condemn me to wander forever in endless agony. End my torment. Please. I beg you. I beg you. Let me hear you say the word. Yes. Say the word.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
As Dark Shadows drew to a close in early spring of 1971, Jonathan was ready for a new artistic adventure. He found it on the stage portraying Thomas Becket in T.S. Eliot's play Murder in the Cathedral. It was a sold-out limited engagement at the Central Presbyterian Church on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Jonathan was delighted that several of his Dark Shadows co-stars attended the show, including Joan Bennett and Louis Edmonds. New York critics praised his forceful, insightful, and splendid performance. He next took on the role of pathological killer Harry Rote Jr. in Wait Until Dark at the Windmill Dinner Theater in Texas. When Jonathan returned to New York City, he signed a contract with a management group that convinced him they could find him quality roles in primetime television and movies.
And then I did a picture in Hollywood, an ABC movie of the week with Shelley Winters, The Devil's Daughter. And then I was in Oliver Stone's very first picture. A group of friends come to this house for the weekend. And then 3 strangers appear. I don't know who they are or where they come from. But they're frightening.
My first impression of Jonathan was, what a lucky thing that he's playing my husband, because he was so gentle and kind and good to work with. He presented himself as a person who you knew you could trust.
You wouldn't let anything happen to Jason.
No, darling. Never.
Oliver decided to have all of us stay in the house that we were using.
We're using our own bedrooms for the bedrooms in the movie. And I got up in the morning, I was to stay in bed until the cameras came in. I did that one time. We were all laughing. But there was no time for breakfast or anything anyway. So the cameras came into my bedroom and started shooting.
When we filmed at night, I just remember it being very cold, and it was sort of weird.
You can never run from it. You can never hide from it. The breath-stopping panic of seizure.
I think physical horror is boring. It just bores me to death. I don't get scared ever. I just get bored. As a kid, I was bored with it. Horror is people lying to each other. This inner evil, somebody telling a lie, to me is more villainous than anything I can think of, more horrific.
With the filming of Seizure completed, Jonathan returned home to New York when he received an unexpected call. Dark Shadows, which had been dubbed in Spanish, was now a tremendous success in Latin America. Jonathan was asked to do a promotional tour in Paraguay.
And I said, well, now look, I will go down there just as an actor. I will not go down there and do any Barnabas numbers, because people were always asking me to do that. And he said, it's okay. He hesitated at first, but he said, we won't worry about that. So I went down there, and I think it was sponsored by the dictator himself. As a matter of fact, his wife was a great fan of it, and she had a reception for me and everything else when I got down there. It was the biggest show in Paraguay. They've even moved football schedules around to accommodate the Dark Shadows. They're absolutely crazy about it. Down there is Barnabas, and everything was that kind of heavy, kind of strong, melodramatic thing, which sometimes is a good thing.
Planeo vivir aquí para siempre.
¿Tiene familia aquí?
Sí, parientes.
¿Quiénes son? Debo conocerlos.
Soy pariente de los Collins.
¿La familia Collins?
Mm-hmm.
¿Usted es un Collins?
Sí, soy un Collins. Barnabas Collins.
They did it with such pizzazz and strength.
Sombras tenebrosas.
That title has a grandeur about it too. Las sombras tenebrosas.
Jonathan, with his interpreter Eduardo, attended press conferences, receptions, and judged a fashion show. The last stop each night was a nightclub where he found himself waiting for extended periods in the car.
I'd be sitting in the car waiting for them to come and get me to come in, and it'd take forever. And I finally got mad at them all, and I said, what's going on here? And he said, they're furious that you're not here with your costume and everything. Not only costume, Barnabas wasn't here. They said, well, where's Barnabas? And they said, well, there he is right there. That's not Barnabas.
Whatever the objections, Jonathan was invited to return to South America for a press tour in Panama. This time, he wore the signet ring and carried the famous wolf's head cane of Barnabas Collins. By the end of his second South American tour, Jonathan had become very enamored with the Spanish language and wanted to learn it. He came up with a plan uniquely his own.
I was for a whole year in Mexico, learning the language and going to towns that they guaranteed me there would be no Americans or Canadians or travelers. So I wanted no English to hear any English. I had friends that later on say, why didn't you tell us you were going to be down there? We were down there. We could have said hello. And I said, that's just precisely what I didn't want. I didn't want to hear any English. It's a fascinating language. I loved the sound of it. and I love speaking it.
By spring of 1977, Jonathan, frustrated at his agency's inability to obtain the quality and type of work he wanted, chose not to renew his contract. He was on his own. The choice most likely had a negative impact on his finances, but he was firm in his conviction to pursue his profession on his own artistic terms. He accepted an invitation to appear in a production of The Royal Family at Penn State, University Park, Pennsylvania. He was delighted to return to the theater where, in July 1965, he had played the title role in Shakespeare's Richard III.
My greatest artistic success, without a doubt, was Richard III. I didn't want to play it as the obvious villain. I wanted to plumb various character traits that might not be seen in a casual reading of the script. It was digging deep into the character that made it so fascinating for me.
Jonathan joyfully celebrated the start of a new decade with family and friends. On that New Year's Eve, however, what he could not foresee was a looming health crisis that would nearly kill him. For 35 years, Jonathan was a heavy smoker. As a result, in 1980, he underwent an angioplasty, then a relatively new procedure to prevent a major heart attack. Following the surgery, he quit smoking cold turkey. During his recuperation at home, he began to contemplate his past and future career.
Oh, Dark Shadows has certainly helped my career. It's made it, in a sense. I mean, I had a career long before Dark Shadows, but it made me a celebrity. It made a quote-unquote star out of me. And I thought that would fade, but I remember someone telling me that came from the coast years and years ago during Dark Shadows. He said, "Your life will never be the same again." I said, "Oh, nuts. After this is over, there'll be other heroes, there'll be other people, so forth and so on. Time moves on." But he was right. And then for a while, I did want to shake the image. I mean, I was, much as I enjoyed it, and I'm an actor, and I'm a human being, I love attention, who doesn't? But it got to be a little much. I'm a very private sort of person. There's some actors who quite honestly love to go to restaurants and go to openings and be recognized and be seen, and all power to them. It's you have to be on all the time, 24 hours a day. I'm too tired. I like to act, and when the curtain comes down or the cameras turn off, I want to be in. And most actors have that situation. They can go out of the studio and no one cares about them, but even though they've done a good job, but they're not in that celebrity status. They're just good actors. Good acting and being a celebrity have nothing in common. I mean, they don't go together necessarily. Sometimes they do. Quite a lot they don't. So anyway, I wanted to resurrect myself, as it were, and continue a career.
It started off when I was finally induced to go to these Dark Shadows fan conventions. It was a thing called ShadowCon out on the West Coast. And after going to one or two of them where I would simply answer questions about Dark Shadows and sign autographs, I thought I'd do some readings, give them something new. I think see me as something else other than Barnabas Collins.
So Dark Shadows had a big relaunch in syndication in 1982. I was just about to start an all-boys Catholic high school that I was dreading, and in Dark Shadows I found an escape, and I immediately fell in love with the show. I became part of the fan community, joined a fan group, began contributing to a fanzine, and that group decided to stage the first ever East Coast convention. And Jonathan became part of our planning committee.
The Dark Shadows conventions started, and then Jonathan always liked to do dramatic readings. This was before his one-man shows, and he asked me to do scenes with him, and one of the most memorable was Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth, of course.
I met Jonathan in 1983. Very quickly it became clear to him that I wanted to work, and Jonathan loved people who wanted to work and were going to bring their passion and enthusiasm to working with him.
I did a whole show. The first part was the roles that I played in the past that might have influenced me in my playing of Barnabas. And then the second part was material written by fans, and a lot of it was very good.
There was a vampire named Frid. When into his coffin he hid.
He couldn't get out and began to shout, "Will someone please oil the lid?" From ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord deliver us. Thank you very much.
So then, not long after that, they did a special on New Jersey Network where Jonathan was live in the studio, and I happened to be like one of the fans on the phones.
Enough of Barnabas. What about you personally? What about your career paths for the future? Where are you headed?
I'm going to develop this one-man show I've been doing at Dark Shadows festivals. It's called Genesis of Evil, and I'm going to take it away from emphasis on Dark Shadows and make it more universal for a universal audience.
He had the energy for it, he had the material for it, he had all the ideas for it. There was just one element that was missing. He needed someone to organize it, manage it, produce it, sell it, and he had no idea who this individual might be, but ultimately he found that person.
I watched the special on New Jersey Network, and Jonathan performed Edgar Allan Poe's A Telltale Heart and a soliloquy from Richard III, and it was mesmerizing.
I wrote Jonathan this letter. This is the actual letter. And so I was 15 years old, and I basically said, you are a very talented performer, and I hope that this experience, meaning the special, gets you back into some serious acting. You are too good to waste.
After I watched the special, I decided to write Jonathan a letter.
He had these two letters on his desk at the same time, and he was like, maybe this is synchronicity. On April 1st, 1985, Jonathan Frid had Mary O'Leary, who at that point was in the production office at Guiding Light, and me over to his apartment for a meeting.
When Jonathan explained that he had been reading to fans at Dark Shadows conventions, I said, you could do a similar style with your show. It could be Reader's Theater. And he hadn't heard that term. I said, it's what you've been doing. Take your script, stand at a podium, and tell a story. But it's with your expressions and your voice that you create all these characters, a whole world for this audience to enter into.
My job was to basically troll my local library after school and on weekends and find short stories, poems, pieces of verse, anything that would work for the creative concept of the show. And I found this story called Cask of Amontillado. Jonathan really liked it, and it ended up becoming like a signature piece. It really captured what fascinated Jonathan about the nature of evil. Here's a guy who thinks somebody is his friend, and then, spoiler alert, kills him.
It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace, requiescat.
Jonathan, from time to time, would invite the fans to come to his apartment where he would rehearse his one-man shows. And he wanted constructive feedback about what we liked, what we didn't like.
And he even asked, if you had pieces that you're interested in seeing me do, I would be very interested. And I remember after one of these rehearsals, I did send him a copy of that page out of Appointment in Samara, just saying that I would love to see you do this. I never expected it to be in the show.
There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions. And in a little while, the servant came back quite in trembling and said, "Master, just now when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned, I saw it was death that jostled me."
The first time I met Jonathan was at a Dark Shadows festival, and he was doing a performance of a show he was developing. I wrote for several publications, and I wrote a review. Then he wanted me to come meet him and Mary. They asked me to if I would work for them as a writer. I worked with Mary primarily to write promotional material to the schools and colleges, and I worked with Jonathan, assisting him with narration in between the stories.
I've tried 2 or 3 different ideas, which didn't work, and so I finally evolved this simple collection of stories and poetry. I formed my own production company called Clunes Associates, and Mary O'Leary is my co-producer, and she's general manager.
He was a man of integrity. Honesty was the most important thing. Jonathan said, if we're to be business partners, I have to know that you will always be honest. Even if there's something difficult you want to tell me, don't be afraid, tell me.
Here I am doing not only running a new business, which I've never done in my life, but I'm a storyteller, which is not quite the same as acting. There's a lot of resemblance to it. But whereas I do not have other people on the stage with me, I play to the audience. And so my audience are my feedback, and they're almost the other actors. It's quite different and absolutely thrilling.
Jonathan would get a story and he'd read it over and over again, looking for the emotional truth of every single character in that story. He really worked very hard on these shows.
Hello? Hello, Frank. Who's this? You know me. It's Len. Old Len Stiles. Cold, deep and intense. The receiver, dead cold metal in my hand. Leonard Stiles died 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks, 3 days, 2 hours, and 27 minutes to be exact. This is a damn poor joke. No joke, Frank. You're there alive, and I'm here dead. And you know something, old buddy? I'm really glad I did it. Did what? Killed myself.
Mary booked Jonathan at a college up in Newport, Rhode Island, where the house that was used as the exterior of Collinwood for 5 years happened to be a dorm. So when he did his first performance, it was Barnabas Collins back at Collinwood.
I must say, my first engagement up at Salve Regina College in Newport, Rhode Island, I got a fantastic review up there. It was like a press release.
To see his enthusiasm and excitement that now we were heading into this entire period of his life where he was going to tour was just something so wonderful.
I have to say, as somebody who, wrote Jonathan a letter saying, "You're too talented to waste," being there to see that moment felt like a success story. It felt like we set out to do something and we succeeded.
I got a call from an agent named Bob Waters who said, would Jonathan Frid, who you're working with, be interested in doing Arsenic and Old Lace? We'll go on a national tour with Gene Stapleton. Jonathan was perfect for Jonathan Brewster.
And all of a sudden he was now a Broadway actor again, and you'd walk on 46th Street and there's Jonathan Frid's picture on the 46th Street Theater.
I was a nervous wreck for 2 weeks in New York, like I used to be on Dark Shadows, because I wasn't ready. When I got to Washington after a week in Louisville and a week in New Haven, I really began to enjoy it. Now I'm just having a ball.
I went to see Jonathan Frid in Arsenic and Old Lace. He was so letter perfect. He was so sure. He amazed me.
In all the comedies I've been in, I've never seen such waves of laughter all night long. When the audience doesn't laugh at a joke, it's because they're exhausted.
Johnny, we got a hot stiff on our hands. Forget Mr. Spinalzo. But you can't leave a dead body in the rumble seat. And you shouldn't have killed him, Johnny. He's a nice fellow. He gives us a lift, and what happened?
He said I look like Boris Karloff.
That's over, Doctor. You did that to me. Easy, easy, Johnny.
We were on tour, toured all the major cities, and stayed, like 2 weeks. Always there would be this bunch of people, and they'd be waiting to see Jonathan and to have him all to themselves. They weren't interested in us at all. These people had not been to see Arsenic and Old Lace. They came to see Jonathan Frid.
I do my calisthenics backstage every night before I go on, and it sort of either revs me up or calms me down, depending what I want at the particular moment. I look idiotic back there. I mean, I don't have sneakers, and I look like some kind of a scarecrow back there, you know, doing my exercises.
He looked like a black vulture walking one, and he's very tall, very angular, you know. He would be, I would think, oh, well, yeah, there he goes.
Arsenic and Old Lace, the starriest show in town.
We play the Brewster sisters. We give comfort to lonely old men.
Everyone needs a hobby.
But then their handsome nephew drops in. That's me. And their other nephew, the black sheep. That is I. Not to mention Teddy Roosevelt, a mad doctor, and most of the police department.
For lots of laughs.
For a little Arsenic and Old Lace.
Come on over to our house. Everyone's dying to see you.
I was able to get bookings for his one-man show on Monday Night Off. So he didn't have to stop his one-man show.
I think Arsenic and Old Lace fueled the success of his one-man shows.
To really talk about the present and the future, for me, is in addition to Arsenic and Old Lace, which has given me a complete new lease on life, it has also given me an opportunity to develop my one-man show called Jonathan Frid's Fools and Fiends. So I see I'm not getting away from my reputation. I'm carrying it with me in this one-man show, and I have a ball doing it. And as far as live theater is concerned, that's about as lively as I ever get. I play all the roles. I play everything. That's what I love about it.
He could spook it up 1 minute. He could be funny. He could shift back and forth between comedy and drama. And it was really a marvelous experience to watch him perform.
And I had a lunch with this chap in New York who wants to be my agent, and he's a wonderful agent. But I said, listen, Bob, we've got other things to do, and we don't want to be sidetracked again. I did it with Arsenic, but not again. I want to spend the next 3 years building a tour all over the whole country. And indeed, we are, and we're getting more and more engagements all the time, going to colleges and theaters, coast to coast.
When he started his one-man shows, I began going to the ones not only at the conventions, but at the libraries in New York, after which he would have a celebratory dinner with some of his fans and me, and we just became really close friends from that point on.
Now I'm putting together a new one called Jonathan Frid in a Lighter Vein, which is a little bit of a play on a word, but however, and it's going to be less ghoulish than Fools and Fiends. It won't be ghoulish at all. There will be evil people in it, but there always are. When you can't write a story without an evil element, or a play without an evil element. So then next year, I plan to have ready Shakespeare's Fools and Fiends, in which I will be dealing with some of the fools that Shakespeare writes, and they're uppercase fools, and also some foolish people from Shakespeare. And then my last part of the show is going to be the rise and fall of a fiend, or the rise and fall of a tyrant, meaning a kind of observation, a study of the rise and fall of Richard III.
Perjury, perjury in the highest degree. Murder, stern murder in the direst degree. All several sins, all used in each degree, throng to the bar crying all guilty, guilty. I shall despair. There is no creature loves me, and if I die, no soul shall pity me.
Jonathan and Mary developed these 3 one-man shows. He would get booked at theaters and conferences, corporate events, private parties, universities and colleges, and even on a cruise ship.
Jonathan Frid's Evil Eye, which has been commissioned by the Norwegian Cruise Lines for their SS Norway cruise this fall. So I'm going to be cruising through the Caribbean doing Evil Eye. And that is a quote from The Telltale Heart. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. When my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously.
Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. And I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye.
The nice thing about having 3 shows was that he'd be booked at a particular college one year, he could come back the next year or 2 years later and do a different show.
In January of 1991, Jonathan was doing his one-man show in Atlanta. I believe it was Fools and Fiends. And I took my mother to see it for her birthday. And the show was great, and Jonathan was wonderful, and he was very, very gracious and personable in the meet and greets in the lobby after the show. I was the director of theater at Georgia College and State University, and the next week we booked Jonathan, and 3 months later he was doing Ridiculousness at school. It was very well received, and he was great with the students. He did workshops where he worked on the text from Richard III with them. And I think he liked our town. He liked living in the old governor's mansion, and we brought him back to do Shakespearean Odyssey. We had the Thornton Wilder play Our Town scheduled for the next season. And I said, Jonathan, why don't you come and play the narrator? And he said, I'm not interested in that, but I might like to direct. So I said, sure, what do you want to direct? And he came up with The Lion in Winter.
Jonathan called me and said, I would love you to play Eleanor. A fabulous role. That was all I needed to know, and I said, oh yes. Even though this was really his debut, as he always called it, Jonathan was a wonderful director in this way. He told us in the beginning exactly what he wanted, an overall picture. He spent quite a bit of time on that first rehearsal telling us that. And then once we started working, he gave us free rein so that he didn't interfere. And as long as you knew what you were doing, this was great. If you didn't, then he would guide one of the kids in a way, and it worked very smoothly. And so many fans from Dark Shadows came, and we would have talks afterwards. It was wonderful.
The Clunes Associates partnership was dissolved in 1994. Jonathan, who had retained his Canadian citizenship throughout his 40 years in the United States, retired to his homeland.
Got a phone call that Uncle John was going to be moving back to Canada, as he had turned 70 and I think wanted to slow the pace down in his life and basically just spend his remaining years among family and familiar surroundings, his hometown. And my wife and I rented a truck and we drove down to Manhattan and parked the truck. He had movers there waiting to fill the truck, and we made our way back up to Canada. He had never really owned a house before and was very excited at the prospect of having a house he could put his own stamp on and a garden that he could take from his mind and make it a reality. I was aware that he had a small garden, rooftop garden, in one of his apartments in New York, so he always had kind of a green thumb in that regard.
Jonathan started meeting his old friends from school that he kept in touch with. Every Tuesday they would meet up there at a pub.
He actually kept the ball rolling in that he was performing his one-man show, which were basically for charity. He was always very critical of himself, and he would practice in the living room.
Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. They say, who's that chap who bolted out the door as we came up? A most extraordinary man. Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Sappleton. Could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he'd seen a ghost.
Jonathan asked me if he could hire me to come into his house and help him sort through his archives that he had brought back with him from New York. My first impression of Jonathan was that he was a very cordial man. He was very, he had a sort of an old eloquence about him that was very charming and very, very proper. We started to chat because he knew that I was a budding actor, and he started to open up about his career, and we became friends.
I did Sir Anthony Absolute and the Sheridan's The Rivals in final year in prep school, and that was the great moment of my life when I discovered that I really wanted to be an actor, and I felt I had talent. It was a great breakthrough in my life because up to that point I didn't know what I wanted to do, and nothing was very meaningful until I got that role.
John never gave up his love for theater, and making theater was very important. There is that soul commitment to that art, which is different than film, than TV. It's an empathic art with the audience where you are making a personal connection every night with a blind date and having to win them over, you know?
To an actor on stage, it's immediate. You get the reaction right now, or you don't get the reaction.
But that live connection is what really, that's what it's about. That's really what fulfills you.
When they applaud, we're happy. We know we've touched them.
I think all of us look at it too much as a money game and doing, you know, got to do movies and this to be successful. Johnny was happy to be on the stage and, you know, doing his thing.
First place, the theater company is a family. And even if they just come together to do one play, but you grow to love each other because you depend on each other. And that's a family, that's a theater. Companies get together, but then everybody goes their way. It's the magic of an actor is there's a piece of paper with words on it. It's just words, all they are is ink. An actor can go pick up the piece of paper, look at it, think about it, and create a person who says the words that were on the paper. It's simple, but it is a miracle. And Tennessee Williams can't act Stanley. Tennessee Williams can't play Blanche, but he can create them on the page, always on the page. It takes the actor to lift them off. William Shakespeare couldn't play Hamlet, but an actor can.
So somehow along the way, Jonathan and I got talking about the fact that wouldn't it be fun to do something together? And so I proposed the show Mass Appeal, and it's a rather delightful two-man show. We hired a local director, hired a stage manager. Jonathan wanted to make sure it was done properly, and then we had ample rehearsal time. And unfortunately, on that opening night, Jonathan really became confused and lost his place and was really struggling to kind of finish the show. I knew the script well enough that I just tied up the show, got him off the stage, we took our bows, and I remember him backstage, and he was saying, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I said, Jonathan, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You know what? You're fine. We're good. But it was something that bothered him a lot. And so then we had to make a decision on how to proceed. So we did get the idea of using an earpiece. And so we rented this piece, and that's actually how we moved forward with the run, was that if need be, that the assistant stage manager, who then stayed on script, could always feed a line to Jonathan to just prompt him in varying degrees depending on the day. And when he was on, and he did a great job of that role of Father Farley. It had its bumpy moments for sure, but I was thrilled that I got to spend that time with him. I was very, very happy for John that it went out on a real high note, because he did a really great job, and he had some really fabulous performances.
I, at that point, owned and still own a property in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is not far from Ancaster, where John was living at the time. We had a small group that we called the project team, and it began with work mostly on the website and on the Evil Incarnate, which was basically 4 scenes from Shakespeare's Richard III.
Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous. My drunken prophecies, libels and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other.
When the opportunity in 2007 came to go to one of the festivals, he started to look forward to it. And we started to divide the time between what he was working on with the website and planning for his return to the Dark Shadows festivals.
In 2007, it was the 40th anniversary of my uncle starting Dark Shadows. He was getting up there in age, and so I thought I'll come down and be of support. When I arrived, there's a lot of anticipation. We had to take him around back behind the stage, and I was delegated to open the door.
Thank you. Upside down. Thank you.
It was so surreal for me to finally see how much he meant to these people. He hadn't been in front of his fans for so many years, and they were just so happy to see him.
In July 2010, the annual Dark Shadows Festival kicked off with a very special opening event. Jonathan putting his handprint and initials in the courtyard of the historic Vista Movie Theater in Los Angeles. It was 90 degrees, and Jonathan's back was hurting him, but he did it to please the crowd of fans.
Then I thought, at the Dark Shadows Festival, wouldn't it be wonderful if Jonathan and I could do something together?
It was several scenes from Mass Appeal.
Your sermon sucks.
You haven't heard the rest.
The rest could be the Sermon on the Mount. But after 2 minutes of this, they just turn you off.
I can't believe that.
It's not a question of faith. It's the cold, hard facts of the pulpit.
What are you suggesting I do?
I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you, don't kick ass.
That was the final performance that we had from Jonathan. So that is a particular moment in time that I cherish.
Johnny and I were very good friends, and it was a surprise, a big surprise that it happened. Jonathan is a reserved human being, a lot of class. The thing about Jonathan, Frid, and myself, we are two poles apart as human beings, and we became great friends on that show. I mean, great friends. I look to this day as Jonathan is probably one of the 5 or 6 best friends I've ever had in my life. I remember when I was moving into a new apartment, I was just married, and he gave me all this furniture and stuff, and we used to go up to his apartment, this lovely, beautiful apartment overlooking the Queensboro Bridge, having a nice steak dinner out, and there was this beautiful bridge before you. Johnny was a good friend, a deeply good friend.
It was fun. Jonathan liked to cook, and I loved to cook. So often I cooked at his place, he cooked at my place. We even went to the picnics in Central Park, the Philharmonic concerts, and that was a wonderful time.
John was at my wedding, and when my first 2 children were born, he was at the house, and he was holding them, and he was at our shindigs, and we had so many lunches together. He was a nice friend to have, and I'm really, really very grateful for the time that we had together.
In those days, it was illegal to be gay. And this played on his mind. And so he was never overtly gay. I talked to my friends who are now in their 80s, and they did the same thing. We were embarrassed about it. We never really talked about it.
He'd never really had a significant other. And I did find this, I think, a little bit interesting about him, but he always seemed very content. He seemed very, very content to just live his life on his own as he liked, and he got to do exactly what he wanted to do.
He took pleasure in the simple things, such as sitting at his favorite restaurant, Sammy Joe's, invariably at the same seat, and he would look out on this tall pine tree and was just amazed at the size of it and the perfection of it. He would come to my house, always sit in the same seat, looking out at the garden. He just loved that vantage point. He was basically a man of simple pleasures, really.
He became more of a father figure for me as my dad passed away when I was 25, so I looked up to him as a person that I could trust and talk to, and he was always there for support.
Working for Jonathan was incredibly validating because I had a voice at the table. I was always heard. He taught me by his behavior. He taught me by the way he regarded me, the way he regarded the fans.
Jonathan Frid was one of the most compassionate men that I ever met. I lost a sister to cancer in 1988. From the day that she was diagnosed, she was terminal. After my sister passed away, he was doing his one-man show, around the country, and he literally had one-night stands everywhere. And he called me up and let me pour my heart out to him because I was devastated. The things that this man said to me, I'll never forget it.
The AIDS epidemic tragically took the lives of some of Jonathan's Dark Shadows co-stars, as well as some of his closest friends, whom I had the pleasure of meeting. Jonathan showed strength and courage through it all. At a time when people were afraid to be near an AIDS patient, Jonathan would sit by a dying friend's bedside to talk, to listen, or just hold his hand.
When he got into his 80s, he had some mobility issues. He had taken a couple of falls. His house had different levels, and that was part of the reason he moved to a one-floor condo. His memory was starting to fail him, as it fails all of us, but he always stayed on track as far as what he wanted to do. His desire to do things was strong, but his ability to do them was starting to diminish as he got older.
One day I just picked up the phone and called him, and I said, is it possible we could get together? He says, oh, dude, I don't leave my place anymore. He says, in fact, I'm in my robe. I must say we had a laugh about that on the phone.
In the summer of 2011, production began on a feature film of Dark Shadows directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp as Barnabas Collins. On short notice, David Selby, Catherine Lee Scott, Laura Parker, and Jonathan were requested to fly to London for 1 day of filming. At age 86, Jonathan no longer had the stamina for what turned out to be 20 hours of travel. He arrived completely worn out.
I knew at that time that I was going to be watchful for John and to make sure that, like, if we stepped off a curb, I had my hand there to help to get down. But anyway, we end up over there meeting Tim and Johnny, and they couldn't have been nicer. The only experience that was difficult is because no one was communicating exactly what it was we were doing there, why we were there, besides sitting around in a dressing room and observing.
They finally filmed a scene in which Barnabas greets the quartet, arriving as party guests, in the doorway of Collinwood. After 3 takes, Jonathan was exhausted and had to rest in his dressing room. Later, he caught the next flight back to Toronto.
I've heard rumors that there was a movie in 2012 that was made by Tim Burton, who I've admired as a filmmaker. They say Johnny Depp was in it as Barnabas Collins, but it doesn't really exist in my world.
The character of Barnabas just did not work. And you could not put that character into a league with Jonathan Frid doing Barnabas.
I saw John a week before he died. He'd had a fall. It appeared to me that he had a pretty serious concussion. But we chatted and we talked about the festival coming up and the plans. And I knew at that point that I was not going to see him alive again.
Well, Uncle John never wanted to have a fuss made over him alive, and certainly after he passed, he would not have wanted a fuss made over him either. So we got together at one of his favorite restaurants in Ancaster. We didn't involve a lot of people, only the kind of inner circle of family and friends.
When Jonathan passed away in April 2012, his family was rather surprised to learn in the will that he had left the bulk of his estate to the Hamilton Community Foundation.
We are the oldest and largest of the community foundations in Ontario. Among the founding directors was H.P. Frid, and our foundation really was the vision of a group of old industrialists in Hamilton, including Mr. Frid, to leave a legacy. They knew that they had done remarkably well here financially. They had a deep sense of commitment to the place that had given them their start. And Mrs. Frid, in fact, was a director and active board member in the 1960s. John had a wide range of interests and causes that he supported, and through his legacy continues to support, beginning with Hillfield, the school that he had attended, his passion for the arts, but he also was deeply dedicated to education, to poverty, to the environment. And so if you look at the range of causes that he supported, it is extraordinarily wide and deep. And he was very thoughtful about the difference he wanted to make.
I thought he was a very charming and gentle man.
And the great thing about Jonathan was he was fearless. He would do anything. He just loved the theater.
You couldn't work with a better person and a kinder person.
He never played the star, nothing like that. He was the most down-to-earth and lovable, funny guy. Very dedicated, very professional. He was super to work with.
I really enjoyed Jonathan. I enjoyed him very much because he was a kind soul. And also he was a very hard worker. Shakespeare didn't intimidate him. He was at home with Shakespeare. And he enjoyed playing it, and he enjoyed acting it. And I can say I was very lucky in my lifetime to have worked with a person as knowledgeable and as loving and as caring as Jonathan. So that's it.
Jonathan told me to believe in myself and that I could do anything that I wanted to do, and I believed him. And in believing him, I believed in myself. And the only thing I can say is thank you, Jonathan, and I miss you.
We respected each other, we collaborated, and when the work was done, it was done. And I'll never forget him. You know, I'll never be able to thank him and Mary for, you know, what they did for me. And I was just very lucky.
He was somebody that had a quiet dignity about him. And I think he had learned through his upbringing that you treated everybody with respect and kindness. I felt lucky to know him. He was truly an extraordinary human being.
There was not a single instant ever in our relationship that was anything but, how are you, dear friend? We got along from the very first moment. And we never let go of that, never. And I was always thankful for him that he welcomed me with open arms. And we continued that friendship right straight through.
You know, he was a class act. God.
Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, we're all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which inherit it shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
this room, and there were a whole bunch of people, all kind of creepy looking. And I thought, oh, I don't have a chance here. Ho, ho, ho. But apparently to them, I was the creepiest of the bunch.
John was always very, very funny about the irony of this man who set out to be perhaps an American Olivier and became a bat.